The talk you are about to hear is titled Toward the Establishment of a Capitalist Society. It was delivered by Dr. George Reisman at a one-day seminar for the Jefferson School in New York City on October the 11th, 1986.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In my talk today, I'm going to present a long-range program for the achievement of a capitalist society. My purpose is to offer a guide to moving from where we are now to full laissez-faire capitalism. I believe that the time is ripe for the statement of such a program. A capitalist society is something all of us in this room want to achieve. The writings of Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises provide the intellectual basis for such a society. It is time to begin seriously projecting just how we are going to achieve it. The very first thing we must do, I believe, is make the conscious, explicit choice that we seriously want to achieve a capitalist society and are prepared to work for its achievement. We need to view ourselves as active agents of change, working toward a definite goal, capitalism. The advocacy of capitalism has not been present in the political spectrum. The political controversies of the last several generations have been carried on between the liberals, who stand for socialism, and the conservatives, who stand for nothing except what other groups, including the liberals, have managed to establish as the country's tradition. The success of the liberals in enacting their program shows that what we need is a group of educated and articulate individuals who adopt the achievement of capitalism as their goal. Such individuals, dedicated to maintaining constant progress toward the achievement of capitalism, would, in my opinion, constitute a de facto capitalist party, even if the name of such a party never appeared on a ballot. The program I will present is both political and educational in nature. It is political in that it centers on offering specific political proposals, which, if adopted, would move the country toward capitalism. It is educational in that it views the basic problem that we face as one of explaining to the American people the value of a capitalist society and the value of the specific steps required to achieve it. What people do is determined by what they think. If we want to change the political practice, there is no other way but to change people's political philosophy and economic theories. Accordingly, every political proposal that I suggest is itself intended to serve as a vehicle for educating the public and for attracting talented individuals to our cause, who in turn will become capable of educating others to the value of our program. In my talk, I speak of political campaigns over various issues. Please understand that I am not speaking merely or even primarily of campaigns carried out in connection with elections. Rather, I am speaking of campaigns carried out year in and year out as part of a process of continuous education of the public. Further, I think that to achieve capitalism, it will ultimately be necessary for a formally organized capitalist party to come into existence, whose primary function will actually be to serve as an educational institution. It would have a book publishing house, a theoretical journal, a magazine devoted to current issues, and a leadership school. All of these would be devoted at least as much to questions of political philosophy and economic theory as to political activity. The political proposals I will make are short and intermediate range as well as long range in nature. I believe that it will take several generations to achieve a fully capitalist society. It will not be enough just to present our long-range goals. It will be necessary to present a whole intervening series of short and intermediate range goals whose enactment will represent progress toward our long-range goals. The major political task in the years ahead will be continuously to formulate such short and intermediate range goals and to keep the country moving in the direction of full capitalism by means of their successive achievement. The short and intermediate range goals I offer are intended to illustrate principles of strategy and tactics and thus to serve as a pattern. The capitalist society we want to achieve is a society in which individual rights are consistently and scrupulously respected, in which, as Ayn Rand put it, the initiation of physical force is barred from human relationships. We want a society in which the role of government is limited to the protection of individual rights, and in which, therefore, the government uses force only in defense and retaliation against the initiation of force. We want a society in which property rights are recognized as among the foremost human rights, a society in which no one is made to suffer for his success by being sacrificed to the envy of others, a society in which all land, natural resources, and other means of production are privately owned. In such a society, the size of government would be about 10% of what it now is in terms of government spending. Most of the government as it now exists would be swept away. All of the alphabet agencies and all of the cabinet departments, with the exceptions of defense, state, justice, and treasury. If these brief remarks can serve as a description of the capitalist society we want to achieve, let us now turn to a series of political proposals for its actual achievement. I will begin simply by listing 7 headings and then go on to elaborate them. My headings are privatization of property, freedom of production and trade, abolition of the welfare state, abolition of income and inheritance taxes, establishment of gold as money, pro-capitalist foreign policy, and separation of state from education, science, and religion. Under each of these heads, I will attempt to develop specific issues and programs that can be fought for, each of which will serve to promote the spread of our entire political economic philosophy. The privatization of property is the most fundamental aspect of a capitalist political program. In addition, its discussion is well suited to illustrate strategy and tactics applicable to the pursuit of all aspects of a pro-capitalist political program. Privatization embraces the sale of all government-owned lands and natural resources. It entails the sale of TVA and all other public power facilities, the sale of Amtrak and Conrail, the post office, the public schools, universities, and hospitals, the national parks, and the public highway system. It also entails the establishment of the airwaves as private property, and the establishment of private property rights under the sea and in outer space. Those of us who work to establish capitalism must always be aware that all of this is part of our ultimate goal, and we must be sure that all new adherents we gain fully understand and support the whole program of privatization, as well as all the other essential aspects of our program. But since the country is not yet ready to accept the abstract principle of privatization, we must turn to a series of lesser projects. Success in these lesser projects might someday put us in a position in which we could accomplish the objective of privatization almost completely. Suppose, for example, that over a period of years we were to wage separate campaigns for the privatization of, say, the post office, the airwaves, the New York City subway system, and a major national park. All of these, for different reasons, would be good candidates for early privatization campaigns. The Postal Service and the airwaves have already been privatized to some extent. In these two cases, privatization would merely be a matter of carrying forward something that is already well underway. The New York City subway system would be a good candidate because it would be relatively easy to explain how the establishment of private ownership would create an incentive for the subway's management to want to attract customers and thus to improve the cleanliness, safety, and efficiency of the system. Such a campaign would represent our going on the offensive in the country's major bastion of collectivism, and making large numbers of collectivists aware that the comfort of their daily lives depended on the acceptance of the principle of private ownership. A major national park would also be a good candidate for an early privatization campaign, because the campaign could be made into a vehicle for spreading our views on the ecology and conservation issues, and for publicly tying our political philosophy to some of our more fundamental philosophical positions. In advocating that the national park be made private, we would also be advocating that it be opened for economic development. This would give us the opportunity to spread our views on privatization in connection with our views on the value of wealth and economic progress, of science and technology, and still more fundamentally, the value of reason and man. Each of these individual campaigns would, of course, have to be focused on its own particular set of concretes. But if, in addition, it was also based on the principle of the economic superiority and moral rightness of private ownership, the cumulative effect would be to tend to establish that principle in the public's mind. When, finally, the principle became sufficiently established, we could call for the total privatization of the economic system in one general campaign. Please observe that if we fight every concrete issue on the basis of abstract general principles, our efforts will never be wasted. We will be successful even though we fail to win our particular objective of the moment. We will be successful because we will have propounded and helped to spread our principles. As a result, we will have gained new adherents who will have been attracted to our principles. In addition, those who waged the campaign will have become more skilled in the application of their principles. Thus, we will have the basis for conducting campaigns over the same issue and a wide variety of other issues on a stronger foundation in the future. As part of the same point, I want to stress that a major feature of every political activity we engage in is that it must provide easy opportunities for any new supporters it attracts to become exposed to our entire philosophy. The individual campaigns, such as the ones I have just described, must not only be waged on the basis of the appropriate abstract principles, but they must also provide ready exposure to the main books and publications of our philosophy. This does not mean that handing out copies of Atlas Shrugged is the first or most prominent thing we do in such a campaign, but it does mean that we are very interested in making every receptive individual we meet aware of the existence of Atlas Shrugged and getting him to read it and the rest of our essential literature. I turn now to the freedom of production and trade. The establishment of the freedom of production and trade implies the abolition of all government interference with production and trade. It implies, for example, the abolition of all labor legislation, licensing laws, the antitrust laws, and zoning laws. It implies the abolition of virtually all of the alphabet agencies. It also implies the freedom of international trade and immigration. An important principle that I think we should adopt in fighting for the freedom of production and trade is to show how its establishment would enable individuals to solve their own economic problems. For example, there is no more serious economic problem than mass unemployment. This problem is the result of the government's restricting the freedom of individuals to offer and accept wage rates that would make full employment possible. The restrictions are in the form of minimum wage laws, pro-union legislation, unemployment insurance, and welfare legislation. Abolishing such legislation and establishing the freedom of production and trade should be presented as the solution to this problem, as a solution that would enable the voluntary, self-interested actions of individuals to establish the terms on which everyone seeking employment could find it. In the same vein, we must take the initiative in calling for a widening of economic freedom as the solution to the problems the United States is encountering in international trade. We must show that the inability of major American industries to compete with foreign goods is the result of government intervention, and that the remedy is not the imposition of further intervention in the form of tariffs or quotas, but the repeal of existing intervention. Pro-union legislation causes artificially high wage rates and holds down the productivity of labor, thereby causing an artificially high level of costs for American manufacturers. The tax system and inflation have prevented the introduction of more efficient machinery, and thus have also contributed to the artificially high costs of American manufacturers, as have numerous government regulations. Such intervention should be the target of campaigns for repeal. Similarly, the freedom of production and trade should be presented as the means of sharply reducing the cost of housing, thus making it possible for many more people to afford decent housing. The abolition of pro-union legislation, building codes, zoning laws, and government agencies that withdraw land from development, such as the California Coastal Commission, would all serve to reduce the cost of housing, as would the abolition of property taxes that support improper government activities. In sum, our theme must be the opposite of the one people are accustomed to. Instead of it being what new program the government must undertake to solve this or that problem, it must be what existing government programs and activities must be stopped in order to allow individuals to be able to act in their own self-interest. Instead of the question being, what can the government do, we must explain what it must undo that it now does, and which has caused the problem complained of. We need to show how abolition of the antitrust laws would mean more competition, greater efficiency, and lower prices. How abolition of the Environmental Protection Administration would mean more efficient production, especially of fuel and power, and thus a greater ability of man to improve the external material conditions of his life, i.e. his personal environment. How abolition of the Food and Drug Administration would mean the introduction of more life-saving drugs. How abolition of Medicare and Medicaid, the National Institutes of Health, and all other government interference with medicine would lower the cost and improve the quality of medical care. While fighting against all existing violations of the freedom of production and trade, a further important principle to seek to establish is the exemption of all new industries from violations of the freedom of production and trade. This, in fact, was one of the principal methods by which economic freedom was established historically in England. The significance of the restrictions imposed by the medieval guilds was steadily reduced by the exemption of new industries from those restrictions. Let me now present a program for accomplishing what many people believe to be politically impossible, namely the abolition of the welfare state. The Social Security system, together with Medicare, could be eliminated by means of the following steps. First, following a grace period of perhaps 2 or 3 years to provide sufficient warning and time to adjust, there should be an immediate rise in the age at which individuals are eligible to receive Social Security and Medicare benefits from 65 to 70. As compensation for the loss of these benefits, individuals in the age bracket 65 to 70 should be made exempt from the federal income tax on whatever earnings they derive from employment. Even with this feature, there would not only be an enormous reduction in government expenditures, but a substantial rise in government tax revenues as well. The rise in tax revenues would come about because the people in the 65 to 70 age bracket would now pay more in the form of sales, excise, and property taxes, not to mention state and local income taxes. The fact that they were exempt from the federal income tax would not reduce the government's revenues in any way, because they pay no federal income taxes when on Social Security. They're not earning any income on which to pay it. If enacted today, this part of the proposal for abolishing Social Security and Medicare would probably eliminate the entire federal deficit and leave room for substantial tax reduction besides. But there is more. As part of the same legislation that raises the Social Security retirement age immediately to 70, the age at which people are eligible to receive Social Security and Medicare benefits should be further increased by an additional calendar quarter with the passage of each subsequent year. Under this arrangement, individuals who wish to retire at age 70, despite the progressive rise in the Social Security retirement age beyond 70, would have a year of notice in which they would have the opportunity to accumulate additional savings to take the place of the loss of each successive 3 months' Social Security Medicare benefits. For example, those aged 64 at the time the Social Security Medicare phase-out began would have a year in which to compensate for the rise in their prospective Social Security retirement age to 70 and a quarter. Those aged 63 at the time would have 2 years in which to compensate for the prospective rise in their particular Social Security retirement age to 70 and a half, and so on. The additional savings such individuals would need to make could be made tax-exempt under an IRA-type arrangement. All by itself, the progressive rise in the Social Security retirement age in this way would slowly operate to abolish the system. However, I do not believe that the system's demise should be allowed to drag on indefinitely. I think that no later than 30 years after the initial rise in the Social Security retirement age to 70, the system should accept its last new beneficiaries, who would then be 77 and a half. By that time, everyone would have had a total of at least 35 years to make full provision for his own retirement. Please observe how the progressive elimination of the Social Security Medicare system would operate to promote savings and capital accumulation. The savings of individuals would steadily replace taxes as the source of provision for old age. The increased capital accumulation that this made possible would increase the demand for labor and the productivity of labor, which means it would increase wage rates and the supply of goods, which latter would operate to reduce prices. Thus, real wages and the general standard of living would rise. While the total abolition of the Social Security system must always be one of our long-range goals, an immediate way to begin reducing the cost of Social Security would be for the government to make the following offer. So long as anyone eligible to receive Social Security abstains from doing so and continues to work instead, his earnings from employment will be exempt from the federal income tax. Being enabled to keep almost all of one's earnings might make it worthwhile for many people to keep on working some years longer rather than accept Social Security. Not only would the government's outlays be reduced, but as I noted before, its revenues would almost certainly increase. If enacted, this proposal would achieve some significant immediate good and, in addition, help to prepare the ground for further reductions in the cost of Social Security. The public welfare system, including food stamps and rent subsidies, could be substantially eliminated within a few years. What would need to be done is to begin reducing welfare benefits for able-bodied adults and for minors above the age of 14 by 10% a year across the board. Aid to dependent children below the age of 14 could be gradually abolished by a law declaring children born more than 1 year after the enactment of the law to be ineligible for receipt of such aid. Henceforth, dependent children of welfare recipients would have to be supported out of the welfare payments of their parents, which would be steadily reduced until they fell below the wages of the lowest paid workers. At the same time that welfare benefits were being reduced, legislation limiting employment opportunities would also have to be abolished, such as the minimum wage laws and pro-union legislation. In addition, restrictions on the employment of juveniles would have to be eliminated in conformity with the immediate reductions in welfare allowances to teenage children. The abolition of these restrictions on employment opportunities are necessary to provide people presently receiving welfare benefits with a realistic alternative of living by working. Finally, the reduction in government expenditures for welfare could be earmarked for increasing the personal exemption from the income tax of people who are gainfully employed. This would further increase the economic advantages of working over being on welfare. Once public welfare benefits were reduced to a level substantially below the wages of the lowest paid workers, the problem would cease to have much economic significance. Almost everyone would be working who was able to work. The system could then be further reduced by totally denying benefits to any able-bodied person or to anyone suffering as the result of his own irresponsibility, such as drug addicts and alcoholics. After some years, once the government had ceased to be regarded as offering anything but the most minimal relief from want, and private charity had been reestablished in the public's eyes as the place to which the indigent must turn, the remaining public welfare system could probably be totally abolished practically without being missed. Public hospitals and public clinics could also gradually be abolished. Their operation and the ownership of their assets could be turned over to recognized private charities, which would temporarily receive public funds to finance their operation. But the appropriation of public funds for such purposes would steadily fall, again, say at the rate of 10% per year. These charity hospitals and clinics would be empowered to charge fees to their patients at their discretion to help compensate for the loss of government funds. It should be expected that the elimination of government control would be accompanied by major reductions in the costs of operating these hospitals and clinics. Medicaid could be phased out in step with the reduction in the public funds turned over to the now private charity hospitals and charity clinics. I have to remark that a vital aspect of the campaign for the abolition of the welfare system must be the conversion of intellectual opinion among the groups most affected. The abolition of the welfare system must be realized to be indispensable to the genuine assimilation of all groups into American society and essential to the opportunities of every person now on the welfare rolls who would like to make something of his life and to the opportunities available to his children. I have cited the abolition of income and inheritance taxes as a major feature of a capitalist political program. Their total abolition is a vital ultimate goal required by the individual's right to his own property. In addition, progress toward their abolition helps to create the conditions required for economic progress by increasing economic incentives and the ability to save. It should be realized that the more rapidly economic progress can take place, thanks to reductions in the income and inheritance tax, the more rapidly can the relative size of the government in the economic system be reduced. If economic progress can take place at a rate of, say, 3% a year, then even if government activity were not reduced at all, the relative size of the government in the economic system would be cut in half in a single generation. For in that time, economic progress would have succeeded in doubling the size of the economic system. I think that these facts imply two important principles pertaining to our political program. First, in reducing income tax rates, our primary emphasis should usually be on reducing the maximum rates, until there exists only a single proportionate income tax rate. Reductions in the upper brackets have the greatest impact in strengthening economic incentives and saving, and thus do the most to bring about economic progress. We need to make the public aware of how everyone benefits from these tax reductions, of how they operate to raise the demand for labor and thus wages, and at the same time to increase the supply of goods, which reduces prices. Second, a minimal short-run political demand we should make is that the level of real per capita government spending be immediately frozen so that it does not exceed its current level. Such a demand would be a call not for the immediate abolition of the welfare state and improper government activity of all kinds, but a demand for an immediate cessation in their further growth. Its implementation would result in continued automatic shrinkage in the relative size of the government so long as economic progress continued. A possible way to start on the elimination of the income inheritance tax right now would be to fight for the immediate adoption of a universal exemption of 51% of everyone's income from federal, state, and local income taxation under all circumstances. This would be in the name of the principle that the individual is the owner of his own income. The 51% exemption would constitute meaningful recognition of this principle. Over the years, we would work to increase the tax-exempt portion of everyone's income while reducing the rates on the taxable portion until the income tax was totally abolished. Given the drastic reductions in welfare state spending I have proposed and the achievement of economic progress, it should be possible to phase out the income tax entirely over the course of a generation. The most important short-run goal we should emphasize in connection with taxes is compelling the government to respect the civil rights of taxpayers. We should demand the abolition of criminal penalties for income tax evasion in the name of the principle that an individual cannot steal or fraudulently keep what is his own property to begin with. Also, we should demand the existence of automatic judicial review of all IRS seizures of property and attachments of salaries and bank accounts. And until criminal penalties are eliminated, we should demand that the Fifth Amendment rights of individuals to remain silent in order not to incriminate themselves be applied to taxpayers, i.e., that no criminal penalties exist for failure to file an income tax return. In other words, we should demand that taxpayers who are presently subject to criminal law enjoy the full civil rights accorded to criminals. To apply our principles to the present tax debate and future tax debates, I think we should advocate that no reductions of any kind be made in existing tax exemptions, shelters, or so-called loopholes. Our principle should be that no one's income taxes should ever be increased over what they are under existing law. It is true that the various exemptions, such as for interest paid on home mortgages, have some economically distorting effects by artificially encouraging some types of economic activity at the expense of other types. But these distortions will become less and less significant with a reduction in the burden of the income tax, and will disappear altogether when it disappears. We should take the position that every tax reform must serve to reduce the taxes paid by some or all people while increasing the taxes paid by no one. A further principle we should uphold concerning tax reform is that tax reductions be accompanied by equivalent or even more than equivalent reductions in government spending, specifically in non-defense spending. Defense is one of the few legitimate functions of government. Spending for defense should be cut only as it becomes genuinely safe to do so. We should never advocate imperiling the defense of this country, which means essentially the defense of such freedom as exists in the world, in order to preserve any aspect of the welfare state. Parenthetically, in connection with the subject of national defense, I want to say that what we should advocate is overwhelming military superiority for the United States. That is our only real guarantee of avoiding another world war. If we have such superiority, we will not start a world war, and the Russians will not dare to. A few words need to be said about the strategic importance of fighting for the establishment of gold as money. As I explained in The Government Against the Economy, the most disastrous economic interference that the government can adopt is price and wage controls, which have the potential for transforming the economic system into a totalitarian socialist dictatorship. A monetary system in which the increase in the supply of money was limited by the increase in the supply of gold would not be subject to the threat of price and wage controls, because the supply of gold increases too slowly to cause a problem of a sustained significant rise in prices. In addition, as von Mises has explained, a gold-based monetary system would compel the government to operate with balanced budgets. It is only the ability to create money that allows governments to go on spending more than they collect in taxes. In the absence of the power to create money, government deficits would have to be financed by borrowing from the citizens. But a policy of borrowing from the citizens would force the government into bankruptcy. Thus, under a gold standard, in order to avoid the prospect of bankruptcy, the government would be forced to adopt a policy of balanced budgets, of meeting all of its expenditures out of the proceeds of current tax revenues. This, in turn, would mean the end of the illusions on which the welfare state rests. People would no longer be able to view government spending as costless. The cost of every government program would be readily apparent in the taxes that had to be collected in the very same year in order to pay for the program. The result would be that the popularity of government programs would be radically reduced. Thus, the gold standard is a critical step both in preventing the establishment of socialism and in the abolition of the welfare state. It should also be realized that a full gold standard, a 100% reserve gold standard, in which each and every unit of money required the existence of a corresponding physical quantity of gold, would not only make inflation impossible, but also deflation and depression. Once such a money came into existence, it would not go out of existence, as fractional reserve checking deposits do when banks fail. Nor would such a money be accompanied by an artificial increase in spending based on the prospect of easy credit, granted out of the creation of new and additional money. Increases always followed by sudden decreases in spending when the easy credit policy can no longer continue. Thus, a 100% reserve gold standard would be deflation depression proof as well as inflation proof. Steps that would ultimately achieve a gold standard, other than its direct legislative adoption, are the full freedom of individuals to buy and sell gold, to make legally enforceable contracts in it, and to be free of taxation on its purchase or sale and on the rise in its price. The process of reestablishing gold as money would be accelerated if the government were to begin to collect a portion of its revenue in gold, say the proceeds of the tariff. This is something we should advocate. We should also advocate the enactment of a legal provision that would put perhaps 5% of the value of contracts written in paper money on a gold basis. This would serve as a guarantee that the value of contracts could not be completely wiped out by government inflation, for the portion on a gold basis would be payable in a correspondingly larger number of paper dollars as the price of gold rose. Finally, an educational device that I think we should adopt is the regular widespread circulation of a list of perhaps 10 or 20 important prices calculated in our old gold and silver coins. I think people would find it highly instructive to learn, for example, that a new automobile that currently costs $10,000 in paper money costs only about $500 in our old gold coins. At the current price of gold of about $400 per ounce, every gold dollar, that is every 20th of an ounce of gold, which was the old definition of the dollar, is worth 20 paper dollars. Shoppers in supermarkets would find it equally instructive to learn that a loaf of bread, which costs $1 in paper money, costs only 5 cents in gold. Such information would make people aware that the problem of inflation lies in our paper money and would be eliminated by the adoption of a gold monetary unit. I have relatively little to add to what Peter Schwartz has said on the subject of foreign policy in his booklet, Foreign Policy and the Morality of Self-Interest. A major obstacle to the pursuit of a proper foreign policy by the United States government is the incredible corruption of thought which exists not only within the United States, but to a much greater degree in the rest of the world. In the present state of world opinion, the expulsion of communist diplomats from the United States would be regarded as an act of aggression on our part. A call for the communist leaders to step down and end the enslavement of their citizens would be regarded as a transgression against their God-given right to enslave, or as it would be put today, as an interference in the internal affairs of other sovereign nations. In order to introduce sound ideas to the rest of the world, a major task in the years ahead must be to bring about the translation of all of our main books into all of the world's major languages. Another purely educational campaign that bears on foreign policy and that needs to be undertaken is one urging newspapers, magazines, and television stations, which choose to maintain officially accredited reporters in communist countries, to provide a warning label on all their reports from those countries. The label would identify the totalitarian nature of the country and state that no reason exists for regarding the report as anything but propaganda serving the interests of the government that originated it. Finally, I want to turn to the subject of separation of state from education, science, and religion. The system of public education could be abolished over the course of a generation in a way that need not impose financial hardship on the parents of any child alive at the time of the abolition's commencement. The procedure would be the enactment of state laws declaring that as of the end of the 7th school year following the enactment of the law, that state and its localities would no longer be responsible for the financing of the first grade education of any student. That a year after that, they would no longer be responsible for the financing of the second grade education of any student, and so on, through all the elementary, secondary, and college grades. This procedure would enable the parents of children alive at the time of the enactment of the phase-out legislation to go on using the public education system if they wished. It would place prospective new parents on notice that they would be responsible for the cost of their children's education. The abolition of public education should be preceded by the recognition of the right of parents to educate their own children, and by the abolition of educational licensing requirements. It would also be proper if the public schools were to be made to begin charging tuition fees to those who could afford them, which would be progressively increased until they reflected the public school system's costs. The fee system would permit steadily increasing competition and growth on the part of private schools, which would then be in a position easily and totally to displace the public schools. One of the most immediate points to fight for in connection with the abolition of public education is the abolition of the Federal Department of Education and all federal aid to education. These measures would create an immediate improvement in education by forcing the elimination of unnecessary courses paid for with public funds. They would thus bring about a renewed concentration on the 3 R's and other serious subjects. In the struggle against public education, an important principle to stress is that the public education system is inherently unsuited to teach any subject about which there is controversy. This is because teaching such a subject necessarily entails forcing at least some taxpayers to violate their convictions by providing funds for the dissemination of ideas which they consider to be false and possibly vicious. On the basis of this principle, the public schools should be barred from teaching not only religion, but also history, economics, civics, and biology. In the nature of things, only private schools, for whose services people have the choice of paying or not paying, can teach these subjects without violating the freedom of conscience. It should be realized that this principle concerning the government's violation of the freedom of conscience in supporting the promulgation of controversial ideas also constitutes an argument for the abolition of the National Foundation for the Humanities and all government support of the arts and sciences. There is some measure of controversy surrounding practically all such activities. More fundamentally, our opposition to government involvement in science or in education is based on Ayn Rand's principle that force and mind are opposites. Government is essentially a policeman with a club. It settles matters by means of force. This has no place in the laboratory or the lecture hall. As an important first step in the eventual abolition of the FDA and EPA, I think it would be relatively easy to press for a law severely limiting their powers to ban chemical substances and drugs. The law would compel the FDA and EPA to prove their case before a court of law in any instance in which similar agencies in two or more modern foreign countries, such as Canada, Switzerland, and Great Britain, find no reason to ban a substance. The principle that the FDA and EPA and their staffs are not endowed with any form of divine guidance could be progressively extended to the point where any one individual was free to act on his contrary opinion. Perhaps the best way ultimately to abolish the FDA and the EPA would be to demand their conversion to private agencies having no powers of compulsion and supported exclusively by private funds. They would then operate as advisory agencies in competition with other such private advisory agencies, free to pronounce whatever opinions they wished about any subject, but not free to have force used to back their opinions, except when they could go before a court of law as any other private citizen and prove the existence of a danger to parties not willing to take the risk of such danger. Our opposition to government involvement in religion is based on the same foundation as our opposition to government involvement in education and science. Government-sponsored religion represents the most naked kind of use of force against the mind. Religion is based on faith. The use of force to impose it or its values is always the use of force in order to compel acceptance of what cannot be proved or denial of what can be proved. Objectivists are philosophically best qualified to take the lead in the battle against the current incursions of religion into politics and government. And nothing could be more vital to progress toward the establishment of a capitalist society. The old stereotypes of the advocate of socialism as an enlightened liberal and the advocate of capitalism as a religious conservative need to be decisively smashed. From now on, the advocates of capitalism must be viewed as representatives of enlightenment and the socialists as the representatives of mysticism and religion. Dr. Peikoff's last speech at Ford Hall Forum, Religion versus America, sets exactly the right tone and provides exactly the kind of intellectual ammunition that is needed for this. He brilliantly shows that religion is not the basis of capitalism, was not regarded as such by the founding fathers of the United States, and on the contrary, in every fundamental respect, advances the cause of communism. No better blow could be struck at the assumption that advocates of capitalism are religious conservatives. Ayn Rand's brilliant collection of essays, The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution, provides an essential basis for completing the transformation of the view of which side wears the mantle of reason. It clearly shows how the ecology movement, which is the last gasp of the left, is thoroughly riddled with mysticism and irrationalism. In the 1930s, the seemingly enlightened left was able to depict its allegedly pro-capitalist opponents as virtual ma and pa kettles, living on a farm somewhere, totally cut off from modern civilization, and projecting utter ignorance and contempt for science and technology. Exactly that image is what the New Left has chosen to wrap itself in with its militantly irrational fears of atomic power, fossil fuels, newfangled chemical preservatives, and everything else that is not, quote, natural. We should be sure that the public eventually understands this fact and that it is with the new left that the religionists belong, as the Catholic Church and many of the Protestant sects have made so abundantly clear in recent years through their avowedly anti-capitalistic pronouncements. Even their style is that of the New Left, with their mawkish songs whose intellectual content was so often wisely concealed for many centuries by rendition in the imposing grandeur of the Latin language. Objectivists should take the lead in the defense of freedom of the press, which is now threatened by sex-hating religious fanatics claiming a mandate from God giving them the right to determine what other people may or may not be allowed to read or see. These fanatics should be asked about their communications with God and about any other voices they may have heard in their heads recently. And when they call for the ban of pornography on the grounds that here and there, in some forms, it might perhaps be the precipitating factor in some mentally diseased and tormented soul's resort to violence, as might well be a mere look or glance or an innocent comment by another person, we should counter with the argument that by that logic, an even stronger case can be made for a ban on the Bible, which has been used countless times throughout the centuries as the justification for torture, for burning people alive at the stake, and for leading entire countries into religious wars. Objectivists should take the lead in demanding full freedom of the press, at the same time that we seek to protect it for purveyors of, quote, prurient literature. We should seek to protect it for the writers of financial newsletters, whom the SEC wants to censor, and for corporations, whom the Congress and the Federal Elections Commission want to censor by denying them the right to support political candidates of their choice. We should demand it for all advertisers, including cigarette advertisers. We should place the establishment of full freedom of the press and of the more recent forms of communication, such as movies, radio, and television, in the forefront of our fight for a capitalist society. Long before the establishment of a fully capitalist society, we should seek the establishment of a fully free press and media as the pattern for all other industries later to follow. We should demand their exemption from all government regulation immediately. That is, we should demand that these industries be freed immediately from the income tax, the antitrust laws, the labor laws, and every other form of government regulation and interference, so that they may advance their ideas totally without fear of punitive action of any kind against them. I would like to conclude by saying something about the kind of work that interested individuals can do to advance the cause of capitalism. In a number of cases, books and monographs have begun to appear, laying the foundations for interested individuals to start writing newspaper and magazine articles, pamphlets, handbills, and speeches, centering on this or that concrete as an object of political action. In these and other cases, the basis exists for organized letter-writing campaigns, the circulation of petitions, placing initiatives on the ballot, influencing party platforms and the positions of individual candidates, and the outcome of legislative and regulatory hearings. In some cases, the basis may exist for running for office oneself. Of course, where the necessary intellectual foundation for political activity does not yet exist, the most urgent task of individuals dedicated to the achievement of capitalism is to bring it into being by writing the necessary books and monographs. What can always be done immediately is intensified self-education accompanied by exercises in writing and research bearing on political activity. For example, go ahead and try to write a pamphlet or even a handbill explaining why the post office or the New York City subway system should be privatized, or why what American industry needs to be able to meet foreign competition is less government interference, not more. Try to write on any of the subjects I have suggested for political campaigns. This activity, I think, should be accompanied by proselytizing on an individual or organized basis in political clubs, public meetings, and the hearings of regulatory agencies and legislative committees. If, for example, your city council is considering a restriction on economic development or the imposition of rent control, the appearance of 2 or 3 articulate speakers against such a proposal might make a difference. Better still, begin to think of how to take the initiative and introduce your own proposal for some kind of deregulation. If you like to write occasional letters to your congressman or state legislator, consider sending personalized copies to all the members of the relevant congressional or legislative committees. If you like to write letters to the editor, why not try to raise your letters to the category of an op-ed piece and maintain a list of newspapers to send it to? If you find that you are repeatedly outraged by things you read in the newspapers or see on television or in the movies, or there is something you particularly like, why not try to write a short piece on that and send it in as an op-ed piece? You may be able to make a special contribution to the advancement of capitalism by virtue of your profession. Lawyers in particular could make a valuable contribution. As a minimum, I hope you will make sure that the major pro-capitalist books are in all your local libraries. Whatever you can do to help objectivist clubs on college campuses would also be of great value. These clubs should be developed into centers of alternative education in the midst of the educational establishment. For the present, if you personally cannot become engaged in the fight for a capitalist society, the most important thing you can do is to provide whatever financial support you can for such projects by contributing to the Ayn Rand Institute. Thank you. Well, I appreciate that very much. The floor is now open to you for questions. So a gentleman in the back here.
Dr. Reisman, on Wednesday of this week, Dr. Peacock spoke on the question of can capitalism survive? And he gave a rather bleak outlook based on the current state of our culture. And certainly many of your proposals would not be well received outside of this room. Can you comment, please?
I have not heard, you say Dr. Peacock gave a talk Wednesday, How Capitalism Can Survive, or Can Capitalism Survive? And he presented a bleak outlook. Would I comment? And also there's the fact that the proposals I presented wouldn't be well received in many places outside this room. I can't comment on Dr. Peacock's talk simply because I haven't heard it. I don't think the outlook is all that bleak. I think there are factors going both ways. I think there are some strong currents in the culture which are running in our favor, which represent tremendous improvement over the last 25 or 30 years. The very fact that the Congress has enacted legislation to limit the maximum income tax rate to 28%. Now, that is something that a generation ago would have been considered ultra-radical extreme right. Now, they're doing many, many other bad things. They're abolishing many exemptions, but the fact that they accept such a principle. It's been pointed out many times, for example, in this room by Peter Schwartz, that President Reagan's policies constantly contradict his rhetoric. That's true. But it's very important that the rhetoric is accepted. Maybe there'll be another president, 1 or 2 administrations later on, that will implement the rhetoric. So I think the very fact that there is room for our rhetoric is promising. I think in the field of economics, there's been great improvement. When I was in college and graduate school, the ideas of Keynes had a total monopoly. Now he's largely been displaced. What's replaced him is not by any means perfect, but it's a considerable improvement. So I think there are good things going on and bad things. We should realize that Atlas Shrugged has been in print now for 29 years, and several million people have read it and have been influenced by it, even though they don't agree with it totally, most of them. but it is having an impact. People, as a result, have been exposed to other good writers too, like von Mises. And so I think we're witnessing a conflict of forces. There are some good elements that are going on, and they're running up against some intensified bad elements. So I'm not hopeless about the outlook. This gentleman right here.
In view of the fact that administrations change every 4 years and enjoy reversing both the policies and the legislation passed by the previous administration, is it really practical to try to implement a long-range 30-year plan? Could it possibly, what would be a realistic way of actually realizing a 30-year plan given that problem?
Given the fact that political administrations change every 4 years, what would be a realistic way of implementing a program that goes well beyond that, like a 30-year program? Well, you would need an organized, articulate group of people who would constantly be pushing whichever administration was in power to continue or intensify the right course. You see, it's a mistake to think that the whole decision in politics is who is president. And I think it's a reflection of the statist mentality for people to think, well, all we have to do is elect the right man for president and he will take care of everything. It's as though the president was some omnipotent, omniscient being. You know, that's how people picture the socialist state. And so they think, well, we'll put Reagan in office and that's all we have to do. Well, that's not true. You need an organized movement that has real depth to it, in which you'll have not just a person who sounds good running for president, but people with serious convictions and dedication to principle who will be sitting permanently in Congress and the Senate, occupying judgeships, people who will be writing editorials for the newspapers and magazines. And what you need is a major segment of intellectual opinion that has a definite political philosophy and which is dedicated constantly to working for it. And that will put pressure on any administration. This gentleman on the end in the middle.
Dr. Reisman, could you please explain two aspects of the economics of gold that I've always had trouble understanding? First of all, it seems obvious that the stability of the supply of gold will prevent deflation and inflation, but how can it support economic growth if the quantity mined or created in a given year might not correspond to the potential increase in economic production in other aspects of the economy? And second, since the price of gold in terms of dollars has to be fixed at some level, why isn't that a form of arbitrary price control and government intervention in the economy?
Okay, there are two questions. The speaker says he sees how with a gold monetary unit there would be no problem of inflation or deflation, but he raises the question, suppose the supply of gold increases less than the supply of goods. How would such a system accommodate economic growth? And then the second question is, isn't it arbitrary, whatever level you fix the price of gold at? I think that's the second question. All right, in answer to the first question, if we have increases in the supply of goods because of improved production, which are greater than the increase in the supply of gold, we still have the same real economic progress, and the economy expands by means of lower prices. See, imagine we had 2% more gold and 2% more ability to spend gold, but we had 5% more goods. Well, 2% more gold can buy 5% more goods if prices fall 3%. You see, it's a mistake to think that economic progress or real growth means more money. The only thing that causes more monetary totals is more money. But what's important is more production, and we don't need more money for that. It's production that creates purchasing power, that creates real demand, Say's law. Now, the question on the price of gold, on a full gold standard, there's no such thing as the price of gold. There is the price of ordinary commodities. There's the price of shoes, of potatoes, and so on, stated in terms of an amount of gold. On a full gold standard, the monetary unit would be a physical quantity of gold. It wouldn't be the dollar. On a full gold standard, the monetary unit would be the gold ounce or the gold gram. And then we'd say, well, an automobile costs 10 gold ounces. And it then becomes meaningless to say, well, what is the price of gold? What would that mean? If the unit is the gold ounce, well, what's the price of a gold ounce? That's the unit. So it's like asking, what is the price of a dollar in terms of dollars? Now, we got into this situation with a price of gold. We began with monetary units that were defined in terms of amounts of precious metals. That was their definition, not a price. The English pound was originally a pound of silver, as was the Italian lira and the French livre. And the dollar, for most of our history, was defined as a 20th of an ounce of gold. We got into this issue of a price because governments repeatedly defaulted on their obligation to pay the defined amount. In Britain, you would have a £1 note. It should have called for a pound of silver, but then the government starts paying out 3 ounces. So then you get, here's a pound, and a pound of silver is now much more than a pound of English money. It's maybe 5 pounds or 10 pounds. And an ounce of gold is much more than $20. It's now $440. So there'd be no price. What we're thinking of as a price should be thought of as a definition. Mr. Hacken, Dr. Hacken.
You mentioned the 28% upper limit as being salutary in the new tax law. Would you comment on your estimate of the countervailing phenomenon of an increase in corporate taxes that is a tax on the producers?
Right. Or the question is, I mentioned the 28% upper limit as being on the income tax as being salutary, at least a recognition in principle that it represents a concession. It's the end of the philosophy of progressive income taxation. You know, when I was in college, the progressive tax rates went up to 90%. And even though there were all kinds of exemptions and loopholes, the official philosophy was the government has the right to take just about everything. We were a hair's breadth from socialism in philosophy. Well, now they're willing to say they should limit themselves at 28%. I think that's a significant concession intellectually. Now, on the other side of it, the rise in corporate tax rates is a very bad negative. They're trying to shuffle around the burdens. It's not a rise in corporate tax rates, it's an elimination of tax credits and rapid depreciation write-offs and so on. The proper solution would have been no one's taxes should have been increased. We should have had the reduction to a 28% ceiling without any rise in the corporate tax, without any loss of any other kind of exemption. But what that would require is a major reduction in government spending, which the politicians are as yet unwilling to undertake. They're afraid to take on the Social Security or welfare system. So there's a lot more work to be done. The lady right here in the blue dress. Yes.
In your proposal to abolish the Social Security system, you seem to be affecting the very people who have been contributing for decades. Is it economically feasible to reverse the order? In other words, to take people off the rolls of contributing? To say, for example, anyone under 30 would not have to contribute to the Social Security system, and they would be fully expected not to get benefits when they reach that age, and that there would be a decreasing amount of benefits from the young decades up, but you wouldn't be affecting the people who are already contributors. Do we have enough revenue for something like that?
The question is it possible to avoid affecting the people who've already contributed to Social Security by depriving them of benefits, yet somehow simply allow the younger people to escape both payment and getting benefits? Is that a reasonable summation? All right. You see, I don't think what we have here in the Social Security system is a classic illustration of a future generation having to pay a national debt. You see, what went on for the first several decades of the Social Security system is the government collected people's contributions and spent the contributions for current purposes. They took the contributions, the Social Security trust funds bought government bonds. That meant giving the money to another branch of the government. The government spent the money. So people's Social Security contributions were spent. It is totally unlike a life insurance or endowment policy where your contributions are used to acquire earning assets which will then support your benefit payments in old age. The government dissipated the assets. It spent people's contributions. Now that means when people come to retire, there's no assets for them. The only place they have to turn to is the contributions of people in the future. The government is paying off current retirees with the contributions of people who expect to receive something in the future. Well, if any private insurance company were doing this, the directors would be in jail. And this is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar fraud. You know, people are all upset about something like Watergate, but here you have the systematic embezzlement of hundreds of billions of dollars. Now that means there is no source of funds or wealth that has been accumulated which makes it possible to pay off the people who've been paying into Social Security. What they've paid is gone. Now, either those people are simply left to starve in many cases, that's one alternative, or the present generation foots the bill. What happened is, in effect, we incurred a national debt. The government said, we are obligated to pay people when they reach 65. That's, in effect, a national debt. And now who's going to pay it? The younger generation. So there's no way to escape that. The only alternative is either there are people who are paying in to support the retirees for the next 30 years or so, or the retirees get cut off. That's the alternative. And I think the lesser evil is to pay off the retirees, raise the retirement age to 70, start raising it beyond that, and everyone will make other provision. That is all I can see as the solution. This gentleman on the aisle right back here.
If we are simultaneous advocates of abolishing the income tax, number one, but also of a tripartite limited government in the form of the courts, defense, and the police, we also need a way to tell people how we're going to finance those. Ayn Rand addressed that briefly, at least as far as contracts go, in the form of a tax on contracts that everybody would voluntarily be willing to pay or could also decide not to pay. Could you address that further, not only in regard to contracts, but also in regard to defense and the police?
Could I address the question of the financing of government, not only in regard to Ayn Rand's proposal to have a fee on enforcing contracts, but also in regard to defense and the police? Well, the notion of the fee on contracts was to raise the revenue to support the police and the defense. It's part of the same package. Now, I would think you could probably apply the same principle, perhaps, to a kind of property tax. You could say, if you want your property protected by the police from burglary, then you pay a certain property tax. You don't have to pay it, but then if you're burglarized, the police and the courts are not involved. I don't know if that I would definitely be prepared to advocate that, but I would consider that. Now, the major prerequisite to a system of voluntary taxation is first a radical reduction in the size of the government. As Ayn Rand pointed out in that article, that is the last step to be enacted, not the first. So first, we would have to abolish the welfare state, the income and inheritance tax. If we get the government down to 10% or less of where it is now, that would be the time to seriously begin considering how to make the tax system strictly voluntary. This gentleman right here.
Dr. Reisman, you included the Treasury as one of the ultimate forms of government. I think that's what I understood you to say.
Yeah.
Could you explain why you did include it and what its function would be?
All right. In my description of a proper-sized government, I said the Treasury Department would be one of the four, along with defense and justice and state. Yes, well, the government needs to take in money, and it needs to disperse the money. That's the role of the Treasury Department. So I don't think that's very complicated. This gentleman right here.
Sir, Sure. You said that in an ideal society, or as a part of the program that we're advocating here, full freedom of immigration and free trade, obviously with other countries, would be advocated. What about with communist countries, or if that meant other statist powers? Wouldn't that be kind of aiding and abetting, to say the least?
A good question. In my talk, I said capitalism implies full freedom of trade and immigration. And the gentleman raises the question, well, what about applying this principle to dealings with the communist countries? Now, I would have to certainly make a provision in connection with immigration. I mean, if we say, well, simply we have free immigration, well, then the Russians might say, well, that's great. We're going to send 50 divisions as immigrants. Well, obviously, we would not apply it in an insane, self-destructive way like that. We're talking about legitimate immigrants. Now, to whatever extent there are people who can escape from Russia, who want to live under capitalism and be self-supporting, that's fine. I would say anyone who's coming to live and work as a normal citizen, that's fine. Now, with free trade, you could make a case about dealings with the communist regimes. I would say that we would minimize dealings with the communist regimes if we simply abolished all government loan guarantees. I think this is a point that Ayn Rand made. Realize that their philosophy is that they have the right to confiscate private property. And they've done it repeatedly. Well, now, if you are a businessman dealing with them, you're not going to want to deal with them on any form of credit. You'd be very foolish to do that in the absence of a loan guarantee. So even in the absence of a prohibition on trade, you would only have strictly cash and carry trade. It would be very, very limited. Now, I think there may well be justification for prohibiting trade, too, if we take the attitude that there's simply a criminal regime and it would be aiding and abetting a criminal.
How about immigration into the country?
Or what about immigration into the United States?
No, I'm sorry, not into the communist country. Not that there would be very many people, I hope, but...
Oh, anyone who wants to go into a communist country, I think we should be glad that he leaves. This gentleman over on the right, yes?
I completely and totally disagree with the government being involved in the welfare state. But my question is that the government involved in the role of being police protection.
Pardon me?
My question involves the government as a role as what objectivists consider the proper role of that of police, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to challenge you on that in the sense of probably clearing up a few connotations. One thing, government by its nature, as far as I'm concerned, connotates political institutions. Political institutions, by its nature, connotates force. My question then is, would this function of government be that of an economic institution, which would be that of mutual...
I think I understand the drift of your question. Let me try to sum... Your position, I think, is the... You're advocating so-called competing governments, right? Yes, okay, but I don't want to give you a forum for a speech. I think your question is, why should the government have the police and the courts and so on? Since anything the government does represents the use of force, isn't any government improper in effect?
Well, instead of that, also I'd like for you to comment on the fact of the government deriving from a market process instead of that from a political institution.
All right. The government cannot derive from a market process. The existence of a market presupposes a government to protect individual rights against the use of force. A market rests on voluntary exchange. You can't have voluntary exchange when people are free to resort to force. Now, some people think that we should have a right to private police forces and armies and so on, and that it's an initiation of force to stop this. In fact, if you have an unrestricted right of self-defense, where anyone can do anything that he thinks is necessary to his self-defense, that automatically becomes aggression. If I think, for example, that my self-defense justifies my carrying a submachine gun down the street, I am engaged in aggression because I am representing a threat to the lives of the people I pass. They look at me and they must live in terror. You see, I think any use of force, the one thing that has to be regulated and controlled is the use of force. And the existence of government, the existence of laws is not a restriction on the power, on the freedom of individuals. It's a restriction on government. People who say we should have a free market in government, they're saying we should have unrestricted state power. They're not advocates of a free market. They're advocates of a total breakdown in controls on the government. We need the government to be tightly regulated and controlled. That's what a constitution and limited government represents. I refer you to, I believe Dr. Binswanger has an article on this subject. He gave a talk on it at TJS in 1983. I hope there's a tape of that. I would recommend that to you very strongly. But now let me take another questioner. This gentleman in the blue shirt. Yes.
Could you comment on what steps you would take to abolish the Federal Reserve System?
What steps would I take to abolish the Federal Reserve System? Well, that would be relatively simple. You would simply have a law eliminating it. I advocate, I have an article that was published in The Intellectual Activist called Gold, the Solution to Our Monetary Dilemma. And the way I would like to see the Federal Reserve System abolished would be in connection with an enormous rise in the price of gold, the turning over of the Federal Reserve's gold supply back to the private banks and in exchange for a redemption of the currency. And then we would have a full gold monetary system. This lady right in the middle here.
In what way do you find attorneys especially suited to advance objectivism?
In what way do I find?
Attorneys.
Attorneys. Oh, in what way do I find attorneys in a good position to advance objectivism? Well, I think they could do a tremendous amount of good by protecting the rights of taxpayers against the IRS, in blocking the actions of so-called environmental groups, getting injunctions against their activity, making all kinds of motions in the legal system. So I think there should be a pro-individual freedom American Civil Liberties Union. And whatever damage the American Civil Liberties Union does on the side of the left, we should have an organization that's similar on our side. So lawyers, I think, are very good at making trouble. So there should be a lot of trouble made for the left. This gentleman right here.
I hear a lot nowadays about the reason why Japan seems to be outstripping America is because they have an authoritarian concept of economics as opposed to the traditional American concept of individualism. Could you comment on that and give us some arguments?
The gentleman says he hears arguments that Japan is outstripping the United States because they have an authoritarian system as opposed to an individualist system. Well, that's an explanation advanced by supporters of socialism and totalitarianism. That's what they would look for. If that principle were correct, then the Soviet Union should certainly be outstripping everybody. But the reason that Japan has been progressing more rapidly than the United States is because the Japanese have had a tax system which weighs far less heavily on savings than ours does. In the United States, something like 10% of gross national product is saved. In Japan, it's on the order of 30%. Now, the difference that this makes is that what it means in effect is, in the United States, 10% of production takes the form of building factories and machines. In Japan, 30%. Now, every year, existing factories and machines wear out, they have to be replaced. you need some fraction of output to replace the capital goods being used up. The United States is devoting barely enough to maintain its existing plant and equipment, maybe not even enough. In Japan, the effort devoted to plant and equipment exceeds by far the plant and equipment used up. That means each year Japan starts out with more plant and equipment than it had the year before. So it can then produce substantially more, and then it has the ability to produce still more plant and equipment and consumer goods. So if we changed our tax system and we limited the maximum rates to a low level, and we did not have budget deficits, which the Japanese also have not had, then there'd be substantially more capital available for the expansion of American business. We could progress as rapidly as they have. Mr. Blair.
I'd just like to make a brief comment. I think you've offered us a proposal we cannot refuse.
And without a gun, without a gun. An offer you can't resist. All right, one last question. This lady, right, yes.
You said before that an individual can carry his own defense to the point where it's aggression.
Yes.
And isn't it possible for a country to pursue its own self-defense to the point where it's aggression to other countries?
Is it possible for, I said that an individual could carry his defense to the point where it's aggression, someone carrying a submachine gun down the street. Is it possible for a country to do the same thing? You might come up with some context in which it becomes possible, but if what we're talking about is the United States wanting to have a defense against being taken over by the Soviet Union and have overwhelming military superiority against that, and we are not going to launch an attack on anyone. We're not talking about the possibility of an individual who's walking around who might be deranged or crazed. If we're talking about a defense, a considered rational defense policy of a rational society, it's not in the same category as a deranged individual. Now, if it's the case that it might be that there are innocent people who are killed in a war. In that case, I would say the moral responsibility belongs on the shoulders of the aggressors. For example, in massive Allied bombing raids against Germany in World War II, there were undoubtedly innocent people killed in those raids who might have been anti-Nazi. But I would say the moral responsibility for their death belongs on the Nazi regime, because we were doing what was absolutely necessary to defend ourselves and stop Hitler. And if I had been an anti-Nazi living in Germany, I would have welcomed the Allied bombing raids. If I were living somewhere in the third world and I had a rational set of values, I would be welcoming the American defense buildup, and even though that might have some risks. But I would say let the buildup go to the point where the Russians won't dare to provoke anything. Well, I think I have to draw a line here. I'm sorry, we could go on a lot longer, I know. Let's take a brief break, and then I'll be very happy to introduce Dr. Packer, my wife, who's the next speaker.